This is something interesting that I don't think I've covered before. This is a recent post by Tom Graham in the Education Forum, and he's quoting Gary Down at first, or Jerry Down. At 55 minutes, he's talking about some video. Lee Harvey Oswald indirectly admits he has never been to Cuba. This contradicts what he told the New Orleans Police Department officers after the Brignier incident, that he was from Cuba. This is why the INS had to be called in to the New Orleans Police Department to confirm he was not a Cuban citizen. The whole Wendell Roach thing. I guess by this stage he knew that lie was not going to hold. Though on the weekend of the assassination, Hoover is still confused and thinks Lee Harvey Oswald has been to Cuba several times, but would not discuss his travels. First of all, this last statement by Jerry Down, I think, is jumping to a conclusion that is unwarranted. I think Hoover was not confused on this point, but that Oswald really had been to Cuba several times, and that's just not part of the official story. But what he's referring to here is when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, somebody from the Immigration Service came to talk to him because, according to the Immigration Service guy, Oswald claimed to be a Cuban citizen. And then Tom Graham says the arrest business comes from INS Inspector Ron Smith, not Roach, though Roach did refer the church committee to Smith in his initial phone call. Ron Smith testified on 12/11/75 that the arrest occurred shortly before April 10th, 1963. He was adamant since he said that he was transferred from New Orleans to Washington State on that date. Roach originally said Oswald claimed to be Russian and spoke Russian, but Smith, the actual witness, said he claimed to be Cuban. I don't think Smith mentioned Oswald speaking another language, but we don't have his testimony, so it's hard to say. Smith either forgot when he was transferred, misidentified Oswald, or something truly bizarre was going on. Unfortunately, his testimony disappeared along with that of Roach, Art Burrow, Orest Pena, and Lord knows who else. And then he's got a link there. And Tom seems to like the ROKC forum. And there's some documents there that he links to. Tom Graham points out a problem here. He says Ron Smith testified on 12/11/75 that the arrest occurred shortly before April 10th, 1963. He was adamant since he said that he was transferred from New Orleans to Washington on that date. And maybe this is why we don't have Smith's testimony, because I think it's very unlikely that he didn't know when he was transferred from New Orleans to Washington. So if he was transferred on April 10th, 1963, that means he was transferred before the official story says Oswald was actually in New Orleans. He was still in Dallas in April of 1963. So how could Smith have talked to Oswald in New Orleans if Smith had left New Orleans before Oswald had ever been there? Or I should say before Oswald had ever been there during his time at the INS office in New Orleans. You see, this is impossible unless there's something wrong with the official story. Now, when it comes to Ron Smith, the INS agent who actually talked to Oswald while Oswald was under arrest, all we have is this, which is a draft, it says, from Paul Wallach regarding Ronald L. Smith. Now, this is obviously written after Smith did his testimony or his deposition. Ron Smith, INS, finally returned my call this afternoon. Ron did not want to come in to testify, primarily because he would have nothing to add. I stressed that our fact-finding mission required that we evaluate and put the pieces of testimony together. Ron agreed to come in. Ron was a Border Patrol inspector with the New Orleans station in 1962 and 1963, transferring to Blaine, Washington in April of 1963. And I have highlighted April of 1963 because that's before Oswald supposedly was in New Orleans in 1963. One seemingly uneventful day, he received a not-so-unusual radio call requesting verification of an alien. In effect, the first precinct of the New Orleans Police Department had an individual in custody who claimed to be Cuban. Responding to the call, Ron proceeded to the first precinct where he interrogated a prisoner. In fact, not sure if booked or aware of charges. So we don't have any details from Ron Smith about what was going on with Oswald. He's just there because he was told Oswald claimed to be a Cuban citizen. Named Lee Harvey Oswald, who was claiming to be Cuban. Ron does not recall if he was speaking Spanish and has no recollection on his own of Oswald speaking Russian. Ron could not give me a date, the names of any persons at the jail, nor the specifics or even generalities as to what Oswald said. After 5 minutes of interrogation, Oswald admitted that he was an American citizen, and Smith took off. So Ron Smith says he remembers interviewing Oswald because he was in custody with the New Orleans Police Department, claiming to be Cuban. But he can't tell us anything else about anything, really, except that Oswald was actually an American citizen. He does not recall discussing this event with anyone, including co-workers at INS. However, when Oswald's picture hit the press, Ron immediately told his wife, "This is the guy I interviewed in New Orleans." What this says to me is that Ron Smith recognizes Oswald as the same guy arrested for shooting the president because of what he looked like, not because of the name Lee Harvey Oswald. So if the guy he talked to in New Orleans had a different name, not Lee Harvey Oswald, he would probably remember this exactly the same way, because he probably would have forgotten the name and just remembered the face, because he forgot just about everything else. And so what I'm getting at is it could be that the guy he talked to in New Orleans was not using the name Lee Harvey Oswald, and it might be that it wasn't the arrest that the official story is talking about, the August 9th arrest of Oswald. I have many files about Oswald's arrest in New Orleans, and many from the New Orleans Police Department personnel, and none of them mention anything about the INS. The only information we have about the INS talking to Oswald comes from the INS, and the only person from the INS who actually met Oswald was Ron Smith. So it could have been somebody using a different name, it could have been a different arrest, and we wouldn't know about it. Now, as Tom Graham said, we don't have Ron Smith's testimony before the church committee, but we do have the church committee's, we do have this document here that's on the ROKC website that Tom Graham linked to. It's not identified where that comes from, but I was able to find out it comes from here. This is the final report of the church committee, and what's quoted here on the ROKC website is the footnote, which I have highlighted there, or which I put the red line next to. And the footnote from page 91 of the final report of the church committee. And the footnote reads, "There is no indication in FBI documents or the Commission's," he means Warren Commission record, "that Oswald was in New Orleans on any occasion between October 1959 and April 24th, 1963. And Oswald did go to New Orleans, according to the official story, on April 24th, 1963. However, an Immigration and Naturalization Service inspector, and they're talking about Ron Smith here, testified before the committee that he is absolutely certain that he interviewed Lee Harvey Oswald in a New Orleans jail cell sometime shortly before his," he means Ron Smith's, "April 10, 1963 transfer out of New Orleans." So Ron Smith said he was transferred out of New Orleans, and they're talking about it here in the final report as if that's a fact, on April 10th, 1963. even though Oswald was still in Dallas. I think that's the day that Walker was shot, actually. Although the inspector is not now certain whether Oswald was using that particular name at that time, which is what I thought was probably the case based on what I read earlier. That is, that Oswald could have been using a different name and Ron Smith wouldn't remember it. Well, here, apparently, based upon Ron Smith's testimony in the Church Committee's final report, it says that Smith was not sure whether he used the name Oswald or not. And this is probably why we don't have Ron Smith's testimony, nor is his name even mentioned in the Church Committee's final report. Because if people know that Oswald was interviewed by the INS in New Orleans in April, then they'll know something's wrong with the Oswald story about him being in Dallas in April. Now, I think it might mean we've got the Harvey and Lee thing going on here. I think Harvey is probably still in Dallas, and Lee is already in New Orleans. And the reason Ron Smith recognizes retrospectively this person is Oswald is because that's the person he sees on television and in the newspapers. But that probably Oswald, or maybe it's Harvey, I don't know. I think John Armstrong interpretation would want to call this Harvey, because I think Armstrong thinks that the guy we see photos of in the media is Harvey and not Lee. But I think it's probably the other way around. But in any case, they wouldn't want the public or any independent investigators to see this information and follow it up. In the report, you can't follow it up because you don't even know who this guy is. So you have to have the documents, which they did not initially release, in order to follow it up. So I present this wacky scenario as an explanation of the evidence here. Ron Smith from INS talks to Lee Harvey Oswald under arrest in New Orleans. Lee Oswald using a different name. Before April 10th, 1963, which is when Ron Smith was no longer in New Orleans. At the same time, Harvey is still in Dallas. That is, on April 10th, 1963, Harvey is still in Dallas. Harvey then comes to New Orleans and is the suspect interviewed by the New Orleans Police Department, for the August 9th, 1963 arrest. I'm not saying he's the guy arrested on the street necessarily, but he's the one they have in custody when they get to the police station. But Harvey is not interviewed by Ron Smith. Ron Smith from INS. And I think I'll leave it there. Maybe I'll have to think about this more, try to work out what I think is the most probable scenario. But this is what I think at the present, that the August 9th arrest is not the arrest that is being referred to by Ron Smith, and that the August 9th arrest did not include somebody claiming to be a Cuban citizen. That was some other arrest that we don't have the details of. Now, on the other hand, we do have this December 4th, 1963 FBI document, which says the records of the New Orleans Police Department reflect in the desk book for the period July 5th, 1963 to August 10th, 1963, on page 298, item 4843, arrest number 645, the following record on Lee H. Oswald, and mentioned is Cuban nationality. And on the bottom of the page it says Oswald, of course, was not of Cuban nationality. The error is not the FBI's. So maybe Ron Smith really did forget when he was transferred across the country to Blaine, Washington. Or maybe the FBI is lying once again. You decide.